So, with what's happening with TikTok, whatever's happening, I thought it would be a good idea to collect all of my interactions with Tad Sturmer on TikTok in a single video. Here it is. Hi, Jones C. I'm not a Texas public historian. I'm a New York based lover of history and public history. But you touch upon something really real here. You touch upon, the frontier myth, and most people who are reasonably knowledgeable about American history know about the frontier myth, and know that bringing it up is uncritically is beyond the pale, and rightfully so. But as Tad Sturmer talks about in this video, the Patriot Myth is still alive. And it's still alive because it's useful to everyone. But what's interesting is I think online history nerds are the biggest place to challenge it, as opposed to, say, political activism, because it's too useful and powerful for all factions for different purposes.
A film called The Negro Soldier, but is Carlton Moss and the historian who was kind of behind that.
For the curious, here is a Google search of the movie. And here are some links to the analysis, even the TV Tropes page. This book on Lord Dunmore might be worth checking out. I don't know how good it is, but maybe Tad could get some insights here. This book is great. Thank you so much for the recommendation. Everyone here should check it out. It is also available as an audiobook if you're so interested, if you want to use your New Year Audible credit. So, Tad and this community, I think you would really benefit from seriously engaging with the YouTube history community. It's not cozy. If you think it's cozy, it's not. There are all sorts of people covering all sorts of subjects, and they could very much use the insight you have to offer. This is the community that I know of, that I'm involved with, and they love the search for truth, even if, say, they could use some work on sourcing. But there is a huge community to be built. These people are curious, they're passionate, they're interested, they're interesting. And I encourage you to look into YouTube historians further.
The Museum of the American Revolution being partners with Moms for Liberty. This is where we are.
But see, what confuses me about the MOAR stuff is they have, stuff like this. Freedom wore a red coat. Where else would you see that? Yeah, they've got David McCullough, but they got Ray Raphael, they got Never Caught. And they're doing a talk with Michael Haddam, and I only found out about him from your work. Is this kind of making a perfect the enemy of the good? Moms for Liberty is a horrible, horrible organization. And it's shameful that MOAR partnered with them. But should we throw them out entirely or fight for it? Is it possible? I mean, this is probably the most famous painting of black loyalists I can think of. I don't see why Ken Burns wouldn't use it, although I haven't been following what he's been talking about. You probably know better than I do. And, of course, that can be countered by this famous drawing of the Rhode Island Regiment, and that will use probably as the counter. So, people of color fought on both sides. And as you've shown, that's kind of a myth. The Rhode Island Regiment is the exception that proves the rule. I mean, Don Troiani is probably the most well-known painter of military paintings generally. And his work is worth interrogating. And I think he would be willing to look more into black loyalist units, but I'm not sure. Maybe I'm wrong. To what extent is public history art history? What's the nature of that relationship? If you want to challenge the Patriot myth in a popular sense, British Army AmRev reenactors might be a very good place to begin. And I'm speaking from a bit of knowledge here. This guy, Chris the Redcoat, actually worked a bit with broadcast media, TV. He was an extra, and he knows the system and how it works, at least a little bit, and he directly challenges the myth in his content. I have personally met Jonathan. He's a great guy. He's also all about, going past the easy history. He's an interesting guy. He also understands the video creator world. If you think YouTubers are just mindless clout chasers, that's just not true. And I'd strongly encourage you to reach out to all these guys because they do really interesting work and they could use your guidance. And finally, there's Brandon Piscicella, who's really built a community. And he doesn't just cover AmRev, he covers all sorts of history. I strongly recommend checking out his YouTube channel. He's got lots of great stuff, especially this walking tour in Boston. It very much focuses on the lived experiences of everyone involved, as well as directly challenging patriotic myths. Full disclosure, I played a role in helping develop this tour. So it's really, really worth checking out. If you want to bridge that gap between academia and popular, these guys are the way to go. Brandon has also spearheaded an independent scholarly work that humanizes military life and also Indian military life while the British were conquering the place. Here is Chris's video on the depths of the myth in film production at the bottom there. And here is Jonathan's YouTube channel. Fighting the Patriot Myth is a really, really big deal. It's deeply entrenched. And I think the way you defeat it is by questioning its core assumptions. People have been talking about the centrality of slavery and native genocide for a very long time. That's very important. But I don't want to say it's established because there's so much resistance to it. But I keep thinking about like flanking out the white supremacists, taking out their core assumptions that justify everything they believe in. And the core of it is, plucky farmers beating a big empire. And if you beat that, then they fall apart. Because I just can't help but think that everything else has been done. Attack this core assumption, and then it'll all collapse, finally. Because we live in a globalized world, and, like, local exceptionalism, we're the good guys of history, that can't stand anymore, because everyone can talk to everyone else. You know, you can't hide the skeletons anymore. And dead air. Instead of in addition to showing the skeletons, you have to show the cracks in the mythological foundation. And you can do that by humanizing those who the mythologized history demonizes. And in the past, it was, the First Nations. It was, people of color aren't loyal to America enough. That's nonsense. That's what, they thought they served to fight. But now I really think the cutting edge is looking at loyalism and how the British state operated seriously. And these reenactors, I think they're the guys to go with for that. And then you bring in those who primarily focus on fighting white supremacy directly. By the way, so this title, on the top, Check Late Lincolnites, that was designed to fight the lost cause myth. And what he has on the bottom on the treatment of First Nations peoples and their relationship to nature. I hope these give you an example of YouTubers who want to challenge as Adam J. Fields calls, the Hannibal and Panzer's history. And there's interest. There's genuine interest. Checkmate Lincolnites has turned so many people away from the Confederate lost cause myth. And he's he's got more plans, and I keep putting you in touch with these guys because I really think it'll be a great mutually beneficial relationship. They could benefit from your guidance, and you could see just what YouTube can do. And I'm sure many other history guys knew YouTube before they knew TikTok, and it's a tough transition. And you're bringing in the academic public history angle. We're all trying to be mice at the same elephant. We have to bring the mice together to see the full elephant. Okay, that was a long, that's it. You might want to check out this book, Turncoat, by Stephen Brumwell. And this directly ties into what Ted was talking about with reform versus revolution. Brumwell's core argument is Arnold didn't want independence. He wanted just a change in Britain and the colonies' governing relationship. And he bases that argument on the fact that Arnold wasn't really involved in independence, and that at the Carlisle Peace Commission of 1778, he was deeply upset that that was rejected by Congress and that Congress allied with the French. Arnold talked to the British government under the name of Monk, who's the figure who restored the British monarchy after the Civil War. And that's kind of the image he tries to convey. These two books might be useful histories for you. A lot of people know about James Kirby Martin's A Respectable Army. I still need to read it. And James Kirby Martin died very recently. And it has a short chapter on the Newburgh conspiracy. But it shows the world that the Hamilton of the first act of the musical by Miranda lived in. What might be more interesting is this book, Eagle and Sword. This was written in the 70s, I think in response to Vietnam. And this guy, he's still alive in his 90s. He's at UNC Chapel Hill. And this is probably the best corrective to Chernow and Miranda you can find. It doesn't show Hamilton as a good guy. There's a reason the musical skipped the Adams administration.
It also includes this liberal nationalism that...
And here's an example of that, which for some reason TikTok doesn't like zooming out into landscape. But, this guy gets big mad that the 1619 questions the morality of the American Revolution because, the British Empire, after all, built all this slavery. It was built on slavery. And there's a general failure to acknowledge, because it doesn't really fit any narrative, that there was a quote-unquote spirit of 83, that loyalism in reaction to American patriotism was about, in like Canada and the Caribbean, even the rest of the British Empire, Sierra Leone, that, these guys, they're white supremacists, that the cries of liberty are kind of self-serving. So we have to actually be somewhat really serving. And that's what you see with Simcoe in Canada and I guess Dunmore in Nassau. And that's a fascinating story. And to what extent does it undermine the American exceptionalism idea? Can you have liberalism without American exceptionalism? See, I think it's possible. I think that can show that, like you said, Tad, people, ideas don't really know borders, that states are flexible. If America can be flexible, the British Empire can be flexible too. It's like this false contrast, which isn't even necessary. People get so mad about it. And why do they get mad? It's their whole being is enmeshed in the idea that America is freedom land. And it's just so childish. It's so simplistic. And in fact, if they abandon that simplicity, that makes the history more fascinating. That makes the country more interesting. That, it says this thing and it doesn't live up to the thing. And I think that's actually useful, and that's not an indictment, the opposite of an indictment. Shows how valuable liberalism is, that it can be separated from nationalism, that it has its own intrinsic value, and that nations that claim its title often fail to live up to it.
Because now that we know what it means in terms of the collective collaboration.
Which, of course, begs the question, what do we do? What is to be done? Obviously, a big part of that is just making people aware of alternate approaches, but especially what was helpful for me anyway, was looking at, I have it here, Michael Haddam's book, The Memory of 76, that, thank you. Everyone in this community should read it because it shows that all of these places, Mount Vernon, Monticello, Williamsburg, they were not about serious historical analysis and engagement. They were about the creation of historical narratives for varying purposes, whether it's assimilating immigrants into a national story and at the same time, co-opting or ignoring non-white voices in the national story. Haddam is great, and yes, Fighting Over Founders is also fantastic. But going back to Haddam, I'll show this thing again here. How do we fight this? Because Haddam is going to be speaking at the Museum of the American Revolution, I think this week or next week. And is it better to just ignore it, to not give them the entry fee, or to go there and engage? This problem is huge. It's big, but there are so many collaborators, as you said, that, people are so wedded to this vision. And is there a way to thread the needle of being honest while maybe not pushing people away isn't the right word, but is there a way? You can't beat a myth with another myth. That's fighting fire with fire. But there needs to be a single unifying story for a people, right? That transcends race and nationality and ethnicity and religion. What brings people together? I keep coming back to the idea of, there's two, actually. First is, quote unquote, the infinite frontier, because it's infinite. It's way better than the fake, mean, nasty one, because we make it ourselves individually. But maybe individuality isn't the right way to go. There needs to be some basis for community, which is why these myths were created in the first place. And who's not in the story? We need to make sure they're not there because it's ours. Sure, but it's just not tenable. But see, I have come to the conclusion that American exceptionalism is just not a tenable idea because people from around the world can talk to each other. People from Canada, the Caribbean, the UK, Australia, they can test their national myth against the American national myth and vice versa. I posted a video earlier looking at this book that compared people, different countries, different textbooks. And that's how you fight this, by showing that these are myths, these are created, and especially they are not benign. But how do we fight them? By sharing the truth, by amplifying, more diverse voices, amplifying challenging voices. And what I'm constantly challenging you to do, I'm sending you all these YouTubers, and I'm telling them about you. And that's how you bridge the divide. But I really want to hear a response from the community about this. I talk about Athen Shea Films, Brandon Fisicelli. They're YouTubers. They're not TikTokers, and they're not necessarily trained public historians, but they are artists, and they're history lovers. And they don't love history as, a tool of national identity, or as a tool of exclusion, or as a tool of dominance, but as a field of human endeavor itself. So, it's about building connections with people and with the truth, no matter how much it hurts. It's so funny. The same people say, facts don't care about your feelings, get all gooey about national myths. And yeah, I guess liberal nationalists tolerate that because they can't see beyond the myths. But we need to build, I don't know what the right word is, nation, community. Because communities are imagined per Benedict Anderson. I have this book here somewhere. Because communities are imagined, they can be imagined differently. And because they can be imagined differently, they can be changed. And that is the role of the historian, whether public or academic or artistic. So thank you for your work. Cheers. You are perfectly demonstrating the limits of such a reverent approach to history. It doesn't promote knowledge, it promotes ignorance. Worse, emotive ignorance, where, like, ignorance is even a value. Do you know who this guy is? This is Ed Lengel. He's one of the experts on Washington. And I've met him on several occasions. You know, you talk about classes and books. Most of the advanced classes or books aren't even doing the reverent stuff you're talking about. If you want to improve historical knowledge, this approach of getting knock-kneed about the past is counterproductive. It's just turning history into a branch of religion. And they're very different things. Religion is about stories. History is about things people really did. And a big thing Washington did is he was a plantation owner. That's the core idea. That's what justifies everything. Then we can talk about a presidency.
Lying about the past in order to accomplish a modern goal, that modern goal can be making...
Well, speaking about lying about the past to serve a contemporary political goal, you've got the Blue War Dudes. Something I'm not going to miss about TikTok, but YouTube is no better about this. I made this meme, and it's arranged in landscape, and I want to zoom it out into portrait, and it zooms in like this. But it shows Frederick the Great, George Washington, and Napoleon, the three Blue War Dudes of the Age of Revolution. And they probably have more in common than any one of them would care to think. First, you've got Frederick the Great of Prussia from 1740 to 1786, whose life starts with a terrible story of queerness and abuse. Then you've got George Washington, who's built this whole identity of the father of all human freedom as a slaver, and the state. He didn't found the state, but even the Washington presidency, most people talk about it, the great part was the ending rather than the actual action. Adams, Jefferson, and Madison probably did more. And then you've got Napoleon, who's, the horrible dictator. But think about Napoleon. Sometimes people think of him as a kind of hero, but then again, he brought slavery back to the French Caribbean. Even if he didn't own slaves themselves, though his wife, Josephine, certainly did. But the state that Frederick the Great developed, who speaks of Prussia now? It finally destroyed itself 200 years later. By which I mean, no one really talks about the dangers of Prussian militarism anymore. But no, it was actually really bad. Like, the modern world was made, unfortunately, in its worst form by Prussian militarism, not because of the racism, but because it conceives of the state as a tool to fight other states. And by the mid-20th century, after Prussia was wiped from the map, that idea that the state must fight other states, the Clausewitzian model of statecraft, died. And the Clausewitzian model, coming from the Napoleonic Wars, was an extension of the model of state built by Frederick the Great. So now let's talk about Napoleon, which is obviously, very personalist. It's all about the single genius managing the whole state, which works until it doesn't. And Napoleon is a great example of this. And he's also a great example of, building a cult of the state around an individual. And the same is true with George Washington. Because that is how national identities were formed in the 1800s. The Blue War Dude, the great warrior who saved the nation and was its father. But America didn't engage in wars of conquest. Oh boy, you probably don't know about the 1776 Canada campaign, which, George Washington wasn't involved in, but he signed off on it, And he was pretty darn okay with militarism, thanks to Alexander Hamilton. And in fact, during the Adams administration, not a lot of people talk about this. There was a plan. Hey, let's focus on the quasi-war. And George Washington was brought into those discussions before he died in 1799. So we're talking about, lies to build a nation. Like, the political act is the act of nation building. But that is an old process, and it has its origins in the Age of Revolutions. These Blue War Dudes, Frederick, Washington, Napoleon, they're of the same spirit, and they're painted about over the next 2 centuries. But we live in a different world now. We don't need the blue war dudes anymore. We can either distance ourselves from them, just look at them through cold calculation, yes, even with Washington, or we can subsume ourselves into them, which is just a return to the old romantic models. And I'm gonna post this as a picture so you can see the whole meme. But the idea that you have to get all knock-kneed about a great warrior to build a nation. I think the material conditions of humanity has reached the point where that's just not necessary. Because, these guys lived in a place where war between sides was mainly an act of getting a bunch of guys, giving them uniforms, drilling them, giving them guns. But our world is very different from theirs. And I think more distance would be greatly appreciated. So, Lee, what really fascinates me is the contrast between the way Britons and Americans tell their history. Something like horrible histories just wouldn't exist in the United States. It's that cynicism towards the nation's past. That's just not here. And the Patriot Myth, as well as the Frontier Myth and the Puritan Myth and the Columbus Myth and the myth of the American 20th century, all come from the same source. We here in the United States are deeply reverent about our history, whereas I think Britons are more cynical. And I've always wondered why exactly that is. Is it a product of long-standing culture, or is it a product of relative different types of propaganda? Are we in the United States so reverent because of our culture, because our country is younger, because our country is more powerful now, because our culture hasn't had a traumatic defeat experience that large, which I think is happening now? To what extent is Britain's relative cynicism about its history a product of its history? That the golden age is over. Whereas here in the States, I think we're still in that golden age idea. And especially that Patriot Myth is like the product of that golden age idea. It's barely questioned now. Like, this community is the only one that really does it to this extent, as opposed to, right-winger liberal nationalists who still hang on to it. American leadership has not been treated with the same cynicism as Henry VIII yet. But I think Henry VIII offers a model for looking at guys like Washington and Jefferson, not as paragons of human freedom, but power-hungry guys just like Henry.